Wildcat strikes and democracy in post-war Europe. A little bit about the context here. It's a large project which covers 7 case studies in Eastern and Western Europe. But let's delineate the theme a little bit. What is not often known that the year with the single highest strike incidence in the 20th century, according to statisticians, is not 1905, not 1917, 18 or 19, also not 1968. It's 1946. And that we do not know that is linked, and that we know much less about these strikes, the strikes after World War I and those in the late 1960s, early 1970s, is linked to the nature of these strikes. They were mostly short-lived, often lasting no longer than a couple of hours. They revolved around bread and butter demands, more food, more coal, new clothing in this misery economy of the first post-war years. And most importantly, it were wildcat spontaneous strikes which did not have the backing, at any rate not in 1946, of any national trade union organization, whether communist, whether socialist, whether Catholic. Now, these strikes have a complex relationship with democracy. On the one side, they are an expression of direct action, direct democracy, which immediately makes clear the views of the working class. On the other, because they were wildcat, they were in violation of representative democracy within the trade union and labor movement. Now, if you look at historiography about these strikes, it has mostly not looked at the inner labor movement I mentioned, but has focused on 3 rather more political narratives. The first has focused on the Cold War. In this narrative, the communists take a central role, and the strikes that occurred in 1945, 1946 are often ignored, not all that important, apart from when they push communist parties, who are still in government in many countries, also in the West at this time, to take a different position. The most famous example of that is the Renault Boulogne-Billancourt strike in April 1947, which is the straw that breaks the camel's back and forces the Communist Party to withdraw its support for the wages and prices government of which they were part, leading to their expulsion from the government a couple of days later. Now then follows a brief interlude, followed by this period of communist-led strikes from late 1947 until the early 1950s onward. Now these obviously have been studied quite well in this Cold War narrative, but mostly from the perspective of, was this an actual insurrectionary attempt by communists to overthrow democratic governments, or were they themselves overtaken by events? Now, a second narrative thus takes the strikes in the immediate aftermath of the war very seriously, but does so through the perspective of worker radicalism. In this narrative, the experience of economic depression, of fascism, dictatorship, then of war had radicalized the working class, which was reflected in demands for far-going purge of industry, for immediate socialization of industry, for power to elected factory councils. And strikes in this narrative are often a protest against the sort of moderation that was preached by labor movement elites. Again, communist, socialist, Catholics, that were all arguing for compromise, for the reassertion of managerial hierarchies, in many cases also for the reintroduction of piecework and performance measurement, all in the context of the post-war reconstruction. And this sort of narrative argues that there was a grassroots democratic protest, as expressed in wildcat strikes, against the restoration of liberal capitalism in the West and of state capitalism in the East. Now, a third narrative, unlike the first and second, does not see strikes or see these wildcat strikes after the war as a sign of working class power or working class strength. It mostly sees them as a desperate rearguard struggle of workers in bombed out accommodations who had almost nothing left to wear or to eat, for their voice to still be heard in the reconstruction process. And it places a lot of emphasis on the emergence of state power, the emergence of this corporatist settlement, and also in many cases on the sensibility of trade unionists, non-communist trade unionists in this case, in realizing that they had a weak hand and securing for themselves a seat at the table. Now, I think each of these 3 narratives has its merits. But ultimately, they say that wildcat strikes are irrelevant to the story of democracy in post-war Europe, because strikes did not succeed in overthrowing Cold War governments They did not succeed in establishing grassroots or factory democracy, and they also did not stop this forward march of corporatism and state power. Now, I think wildcat strikes have a different story to tell about democracy, and I want to do so with highlighting two dimensions before coming to some concluding remarks. Now, the first revolves around shop floor democracy. We have to take a step back and briefly address the legacies of the war and this immediate after-war period, which changes traditions of industrial protest and industrial representation to an extent. The war, with independent trade unions banned and their leaders in prison, in exile, or underground, sees, especially after this earlier wave of somewhat organized strikes in 1941, the strike of 100,000 in Belgium, in France, it sees wildcat unorganized strikes at factory level, which are also without clear leaders, obviously being a strike leader very dangerous. Under the Nazi occupation, which address some immediate, often bread and butter demand for immediate redress. And these strikes are, in the short run, often quite successful, securing extra handouts of bread, of soap, whatever. But this was a model that brought, again, not on the long run, but short-term success for the working class. Now then, in the final stages of the war, in the early stages of liberation, we have this brief period of worker self-management. As collaborationist owners and managers flee the advancing Allied armies, workers are left to their own devices, also in defending their factories against the retreating Wehrmacht, which tries to destroy industrial property. And there's this brief period where workers are themselves in charge of factories, elect a council that relaunches production for the Allies, and also takes charge of wage issues and of rations and so on and so forth. Now, this model that emerges from the war and the liberation comes into collision with reconstruction politics, or the politics of productivity that is championed by all parties after 1945. The main aim of the trade union movement in those years is to get a seat at the table, and in doing so, they were absolutely opposed to any kind of uncoordinated actions or wildcat strikes. Here's a quote from a German trade unionist: "We have to say it whether it's popular or not. We must see the bigger picture, otherwise we will all get swept up by our own company and only our own interest in our own sector. No propaganda, no paper soldiers, no demonstration will help us. Only work and more work, as we've never known it in the trade union movement. Germany will be rebuilt with or without us. How it is rebuilt depends on us." Now, this is a sort of narrative. No strikes. We have a chance now to get into this system. And even when local strikes at the factory level were supported, it was always reluctantly so. So when strikers at the Belgian steelworks of Cockerill went on strike in September 1945 over a wage conflict, and then asked their trade union representatives, why has this strike, as our shop floor delegates have promised, not been extended to other factories? The national trade union representative says, the trade union movement needs to spare its energies for more important questions, like trade union participation in the works councils. Now, this is one thing. So strikes come into collision with this sort of narrative as we need to get into the system. A second point is about politics more properly, that trade unionists or trade union leaders are often not even there. There's the big strike in Turin in the summer of 1946, which sees more than 100,000 workers down their tools on the street. But each of the three secretaries of the local trade union chamber of labor, the local trade union leadership, the communist, the Catholic, and the socialist, they were all in Rome because they had recently been elected to the Constituent Assembly. So they weren't even there to talk to workers, to receive their delegations, to argue with their resolutions. Now, over time, obviously, this conflict or this collision gets settled in the favor of trade unions, where these councils, it was mentioned in the previous paper with regard to Poland, are integrated into top-down trade union structures. Sometimes the name is changed and the Works Council becomes the Trade Union Factory Group. In other cases, it retains the same name, but they still become part of a clear command structure. And voting which still takes place. It is very important for both systems to show that no, there is workplace democracy because we are having votes on the shop floor, is removed from the factory level in the sense that what your factory votes doesn't matter anymore. It's only the cumulative result for the entire region, the entire sector, the entire country. And you have to abide by that because there has to be coordination, this constant word that is used. Now, second point that comes out of Wildcat strike with regard to its relations with democracy are the sort of narratives of democracy that come out of strikes. Now, on one level, and this feeds into nicely into the worker radicalism narrative, striking workers often understand democracy as equality and argue that there should, in a democracy, be no income differences between white and blue collar workers, and often use the state's own claims against it in doing so. How is it possible, Polish strikers ask, in a people's democracy that a manager still makes 5 times as much as a worker? In Genoa in Italy, they say democracy is a charade. If workers in Milan and Turin get a bonus, but we don't. So there's this understanding of democracy must mean economic equality. However, that does not always mean equality within the labor movement or solidarity within the labor movement. There's this strong divide between the aristocracy of labor of skilled male workers in large factory sectors, mining, steel, shipyards, later cars, and those in lighter industries, smaller sectors, often women, migrants, young workers. And you see that with some of the things that we associate, that it goes against that equality. So here's a quote from a works counselor at the Fiat Mirafiori flagship Fiat factory, who argues about this post-1945 period. At the outset, we were fighting for equality. But then the skilled workers started to argue, but wait a minute, equality, we have more responsibilities. So instead of a collective rate for the entire plant, they requested a piece rate at shop level. Afterwards, they requested that shop rates would be replaced by team rates. And then they demanded the introduction of individual piece work, as in total there's 40 of us, but should I compare myself to him? So this is the sort of story where, yes, we want equality as democracy, but our solidarity is often a one-way street. You see that in strikes as well, where those in lighter industries, food processing, textiles, were always asked to go on strike in solidarity with steel. It was never the other way around. Some trade unions even say, why should my workers go on strike for your workers who already make double as much? But this sort of argument was always missed away. So there's this sort of tension in the democratic story when it comes to part of the working class. One more example before I move on to my final points. Coal miners here at Oberhausen, Concordia, the mine. These coal miners in the politics of productivity were given special advantages. In this case, additional rations of brandy, schnapps, and tobacco. You might say not very important, but these goods were very important on the black market as trading goods. However, they argue, the skilled workers or the underground workers, that these goods should be only for them. But elections were on the way, and now the Works Council has also divided these rations to the overground personnel, including cleaning ladies and young apprentices. These people are at the source everywhere. So then they continue with, oh, we have too many directors and there's also Nazis. But where the cleaning ladies Nazis, it's also we as skilled workers deserve more. Now, this sort of view on the interplay of democracy, equality, and solidarity in strikes also offers a fresh perspective on some of the later Wildcat strikes. You see many strikes in the later years, and here I go against the state power or trade union leaders were so sensible in getting a seat on the table. Many strikes go against the results of collective bargaining. In 1949, we have a big strike in Enschede in the Netherlands, where women who had been in a strong position because there was a labor shortage in the textile industry to negotiate at shop level better wages for themselves, then come head to head with a collective agreement which defines a women's wage as lower than male wages in steel and those sectors, leading to an actual wage cut as a result of collective bargaining. On the other hand, we see strikes again later, early in the 1950s, by women, by young workers, to also be considered in the piece rate so that they can also boost their meager incomes with some bonus payments. Now some concluding thoughts. I have time?
Yeah, so 16 minutes.
Oh, good. Was actually good. Maybe it's the stress that you talked about. Or maybe I forgot 10 points. Oh, let's go back. Why does this period of wildcat strikes come to an end? And why is 1949, only 3 years after 1946, one of the years with the lowest strike incidence of the entire 20th century? And why in the 1950s do we even get all these studies about the withering away of the strike as a means of collective action in any case? Now, all of the answers that the three narratives have given are linked this to forces outside of the labor. It was the Cold War and the pressures that came with that. It was the political betrayal by communist leaders for not embracing the revolutionary sentiments at their grassroots until they ran out of steam. Or it was the onset of state power and the fact that states became more powerful and could deploy the police or the army against strikers. My argument is that we should also seek the answer inside the labor movement, and that trade unions were successful at reappropriating the language of democracy that came out of strikers, allowing them to divide and rule within the working class and regain control over the situation. Now, there are winners to this settlement. The aristocracy of labor wins democratic participation on the shop floor. Obviously not in the sense of worker self-management or actually electing your director or setting production plans. But if you look at some of the literature on 1950s Eastern Europe, you see that in this plan fulfillment pact, and I think it applies to Western Europe as well, you see that workers actually have autonomy and some freedom to arrange their own work rhythm and their own work environment, even in the context of this forest factory. But it is democracy understood in a peculiar way. So democracy means two things in this context. First, it means proper hierarchies in terms of wages. The war had caused too much equality, and it caused equality for the wrong people. Mentioned women who had entered male jobs and were in a better position to negotiate their position. Young people who did not have a family to feed were mostly more skilled at trading their rations on the black market and making a better living for themselves. But also some groups that suddenly took an important role. There's a baker strike in my Italian case study, which divides the trade unions because they said, well, technically the bakers are right. Their wages have been cut, so we must support them. But A, can we really support a baker strike in a food crisis? And B, I don't see why a baker, one trade unionist argues, I don't see why a baker should even make as much as a skilled metal worker, because that's not the proper hierarchy inside the labor movement. Now, in return for this, we'll put you back, coal miners, steel workers, etc., at the top of the wage pyramid. They request order. There's this campaign in Czechoslovakia. I'm a recruitment drive for the coal miners. I'm a coal miner who's better than me. Now the point is, and the party state did a lot of research. What do you think about this new recruitment program? And many people outside the coal mining industry said, yeah, coal miners only got that because they strike a lot, which is obviously not what the party wanted to hear. So there was complete insistence on you need to be disciplined. No uncoordinated actions, no wildcat strikes. When we order a strike, you do it in all, what is one trade unionist in Germany, in all trade union peace and worthiness. You are responsible that our action will be carried out in such a way that we will show the miners' caste the appropriate dignity and respect. So demonstrations should be with closed cordons, should be no uncoordinated actions. And when there is strike, when there are strikes, we're going to organize a big counter demonstration here in Vienna, the so-called communist preacher strike, whereby we delegitimize all strikes that do not go through us as either a reactionary in the East or a communist ploy. So this successful appropriation of democracy brings an end to an era of direct democracy. Thanks very much.
Thank you. That was great to have people with us on trade union or outside trade unions as well. And so when you were talking about the success or lack of success, I was thinking about Susan Stagenfeld's presentation of the Chicago Women's Liberation Movement. It was not a trade union, but a radical feminist group. So at that point in the 70s, when they were not necessarily represented by trade unions, as you know, we already pointed that out. And these radical feminist groups were, of course, neither successful in overthrowing patriarchy nor capitalism. And so Stagenfeld suggests to think about outcomes rather than success. And I think that resonates very well with what you discussed about the Wildcat, that they have tremendous outcomes that are really super important. But using the term success can lead us into a direction in a corner. So I thought I can.
No, that's a good point. I've noted it down. Indeed, so a Wildcat strike is used because it has the desired outcome in the short run. And that's why workers fall back on that method, even in the context of democracy. But it doesn't necessarily mean that their longer term interests are guarded. Okay. Thanks very much.
I might make sure a second one while others have a think. So Jan, you talk about this process by which trade union formal leaderships successfully appropriate the language of democracy. I'd also be interested in saying a little bit more about this, about why do you think that attempt to appropriate was successful? What were the counter efforts put by those who enjoyed outcomes, as part of Wildcat strikes? Did they struggle against that using the language of democracy as well, or did they rather abandon the language of democracy? Can you say a little bit more about those fine-grained interactions and the detail of the struggle that seems so important to your overall story?
Yeah, so what I argue is that, and I think you've seen the other project as well, is that democracy in post-war Europe becomes to mean anti-chaos. So we have a group of people which has come into an inappropriate position or in an inappropriate position of power through the war. And we now need, some others call that a return to normality. We now need to return to normality. And the language of democracy is used to constrain the freedom of those groups who had benefited from the war is a bad thing to say because they too had suffered, but whose relative position had improved as a consequence of the war. Now, did the opponents still use the language of democracy? Here I need to think a little bit about whether that was still used in those strikes in the later years. I don't think they used the concept of democracy very much, but I will look it up in my sources, whether some of these women strikers, some of these young people, whether they also use democracy or whether they use more concept related to freedom or the freedom to negotiate, etc.
Oh, I'm curious about this year, 1946, both because I want to know if you think that how much it is related to the end of labor truces or wartime discipline, and sort of like other global factors. And I'm also thinking about this because the U.S. has a lot of strikes without being in a state of reconstruction in 1946.
so yes, what it is in Western Europe, I know about the US, and there the picture of what it is about Europe is, of course, that the material situation reaches an absolute depth in 1946. So this plays one role, but it is indeed also, I think Britain has it too, where it's already a little bit more questionable because, so I think it's it's the sort of things, the sort of promises that start to wear thin. So in the first months after liberation, when the situation is arguably still worse, there's a lot of, we need hard work, we need discipline, and then the uplit sunlands will come. And you see a lot of this, oh yes, in my Italian case study, for example, they say a lot, yes, but we need to wait until elections to the Constituent Assembly, because the left will win a majority. Okay, only if you only also count the Catholics, but and then you see immediately in the wake of those elections, you see a huge upswell of worker militancy, which is actually strange in the summer because many of these strikes are concentrated in the winter because that's the depth of material depths often. But you see workers, they start requesting in Italy a premio della Repubblica, the referendum where a republic had been chosen instead of the monarchy. They say, hey, that is our cause which has won, so we want extra money for that from the industrialists. And then B, they say, but we've had elections now and we are in power and we still don't have a better life. So this is the story also for Europe. Obviously, the US does not have a change of government in 1946. So what would be your argument there? What for the upswing of strikes in that year?
The labor unions agreed to not go on strike there. I mean, but like kind of under coercion. But like,
yeah, but my labor unions too, so that didn't help much.
I mean, I think like, so there's, that feels important. And then there is like, it's higher than later years because there's a state backlash, right? Like the state does, it does feel like, I guess zooming out, what I'm drawing attention to is this year after World War II is in some ways like the year after World War I, where like people have endured a lot, expect more, have other, like, you know, and like all that the early one gets undershadowed in 1917, but like I think there's something just to going into the war and then coming out of it that encourages a certain kind of set of expectations.
Yeah, although that is, again, I'm not an expert on US history. My experience, because that's an argument I often hear, Wildcat strikes stop because the state becomes more powerful and the police simply arrest strikers. If you look at individual strikes where they tried this, it often extends and prolongs the strikes or causes new strikes. In Poland, trade unionists often say to the security services, which are already omnipresent in 1946 in the context of the Civil War, they say, please stay out of strikes. Don't go and start arresting strikers, because it will only lead to new strikes and more. It's better to talk to workers and give them some vague promises again, rather than go in with state power. So this is my struggle with those who argue, yeah, but it's all the police and the army mobilizing against strikes.